Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Primetime at the PU Library. Primetime at the PU Library is a collaboration of the Friends of the PU Library and many different offices on campus with the mission of encouraging lifelong learning beyond the classroom to the entire Bethel community. Here's an announcement for students. If you're working on a paper or project that makes extensive use of library resources, books, online journals, or any kind of equipment, or any services, consider applying for the $250 library research prize. The deadline is February 15th. You qualify to submit if you are not graduating before May of 2012. The work can be in any medium, a paper, a video. The work must have been completed in spring or fall 2011 or interim 2012. The application does not require additional research beyond the project submitted as coursework, only an additional short essay about the research process. There's information on the library website, and the link is on a slip here, which will be provided by the refreshments in the file. Next Tuesday, November 22nd, Samuel Zawanga, who won the Faculty Excellence Award, will present on the fragile dignity of humanity and the disappearance of the human. So today we have Isaac Sanborn, who will be talking about his experience in studying in the Middle East.
Hey, welcome everyone. As Holly said, I'm presenting on my semester in the Middle East, which was this past spring, from January to about April. I'd like to begin us with some preliminary reflections. These were things that I was thinking about while I was studying abroad. They're a bit diverse, but all very deep and very interesting. The first one is by the Japanese poet Basho. He said, "Seek not to follow in the footsteps of the men of old, rather seek what they sought." There's also an Indian proverb that I heard before studying abroad, which is, "It's better to dig one deep well than 10 shallow ones." Also, these last two, from some very ancient, deep thinkers, "The unexamined life is not worth living, and with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." That's from Ecclesiastes. And I believe that I lived about all of these while I was studying abroad and experienced them and the truth of them. So I suggest we start at the beginning in seeking what they sought, not necessarily going in the footsteps of people who have gone before me, but seeking the same thing. I began my semester in Egypt, arriving in Cairo and moving into a neighborhood called Guza, which is right across from Tahrir Square, right across the Nile River. It's a beautiful place. We had a couple weeks of immersion in the culture and in the language. We got to have a boat ride on the Nile River, which was a beautiful time. And also got to do some tourist activities. We went to a really old, it's basically a really old shopping mall called Khan al-Khalili in Cairo. Got to experience some of the culture there. And I did get to do some of the tourist things, like going to visit the pyramids and the Sphinx. It's a fun time. But we were soon interrupted or redirected while we were on a trip in a southern city called Luxor in Cairo, in Egypt. We had gone there to see a lot of the ancient monuments, and when we arrived at our hotel, we realized that people were organizing in the streets and moving and about to protest the police and the Mubarak regime. So our director immediately herded us into the hotel and said, "We can't go out on the streets, we can't do our activities for the day, everyone stay here." But the thing about being in a hotel is you can watch everything from your balcony or from the windows. So I saw a lot of things happening. There were some pretty serious police to stop the demonstrations. Yeah, I was very close to it all as it was happening. We came back from Luxor to Cairo and were immediately put under a curfew that was partly mandated by the government, but partly just safety because of our directors, and we don't want to be outside right now. And we were there for a few more days before leaving. Egypt, and going to Istanbul, Turkey, until further notice. Istanbul was a beautiful city. We had many brilliant guest speakers telling us about the intersection of religion and politics in Turkey, which is really interesting. I will focus on that, though. I got to do some sightseeing. This is one of the oldest buildings in the region, the Hagia Sophia, which was first a Byzantine church and then a mosque, and is now a museum. After Istanbul, we then traveled to Israel and arrived in Tel Aviv mid-February. And immediately I recognized the tension between the two cultures that are in Israel and Palestine at present. There are the Israelis and the Jews, and there are Palestinians in the same land. There's a saying that God told both the Jews and the Palestinians that the land is theirs, but forgot to tell the other person. Israel looks a lot like this. It's very mountainous, really beautiful land. This was in Palestine. And in my months there, I learned to love the land, but also to love the people of the land. So that's a bit of an overview. We were staying in outside Jerusalem, very close to the border between Israel and Palestine, within walking distance of a checkpoint. And this is a picture from the road on the way from our home at Tantur, an ecumenical institute, on the way to Palestine, on the way to Bethlehem. I thought it was really beautiful. You can see barbed wire there, but also a sunset, or there's beauty in the land that somehow coexists with all of the violence and all of the tension. So I'd like to focus a bit more on faith development that I had while I was in the semester, and experiencing the living God. And this is where the quote, "better to dig one deep well than 10 shallow ones," comes in. That was my anchor during all of this. A call for humility from Vincent Donovan, a 20th century missionary. He says, "The day we are completely satisfied with what we have been doing, the day we have found the perfect, unchangeable system of work, the perfect answer, never in need of being corrected again, on that day we will know that we are wrong, that we have made the greatest mistake of all." I like that a lot. A second call for humility, just in case the first one wasn't enough. "Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to." This is very convicting, because when Jesus was speaking, he was speaking to the religious leaders of his day. He was not speaking to rebels who were outside of the faith of the time. He was speaking to people who were at the core of it, saying, you miss it. You have no humility. And while you're trying to keep other people out, you're missing it yourself. So stop. Have some humility. We heard some great speakers, and one of them was a member of a local synagogue in Israel, and he told us about this brilliant Swedish bishop, Christer Stendahl, who did excellent work in Jewish and Christian interfaith dialogue. And Christer Stendahl has some guidelines for interfaith interactions. First one, when you're trying to understand another religion, you should ask the adherents of that religion and not its enemies. Let the people speak for themselves. Second, don't compare your best to their worst. Christianity is a faith of grace, but that does not mean that we are allowed to compare our grace with Islam's struggles. There are deep struggles within Christianity that we need to air and let it be part of the conversation. And also to recognize the best of Islam and Judaism. Which leads me to the third, leaving room for holy envy, which is not wanting to convert necessarily, but recognizing that there are things in the other faith that we don't have that we could really learn from. Things that deepen us and instruct us about God, because we don't have a monopoly on God. So when it comes to loving God, who is in and who is out? One of the most confounding parables for me is the parable of the wedding banquet. It turns everything inside out. The parable goes like this. There's a wealthy man who owns an estate, and he invites people to a wedding banquet. And everyone who's invited to this banquet refuses to come. They won't come in. So he tries again. He sends more messengers out to invite people, and they still don't come in. So he says, okay, go to the streets and invite everybody. Anybody. Random people who I've never met before. They're invited. So people come to the party. But the thing is that there's this one guy at the party who isn't wearing wedding garments. And the master looks at him and says, what do you think you're doing? And he has his messengers tie the guy up and throw him out into the street. And the problem with this parable is I have no idea what it means. But it really calls into question who's in and who's out, who's at the banquet, who's allowed into the party, and who was invited to the party but just didn't quite get there. So, with that in mind, I'm not really sure what to do with that. But do I believe that the other can teach me, bless me, and correct me in the matters of God? And that is a lot more difficult than just talking with them and saying, oh yeah, that's fine, but keeping a distance between us. If I can let the other person instruct me and school me on some things, that's a bigger challenge and much more worth doing, I think. So there's a book, Exclusion and Embrace, by Miroslav Volf, and one of his main ideas is the idea of double vision, which is enlarging our thinking by letting the voices and perspectives of others, especially those with whom we may be in conflict, resonate within ourselves. And it's only by practicing double vision, Wolf says, that we can really have any hope of understanding the other and then moving deeper to working with the other for something greater than both of us. So one of the ideas that I wrestled with when I was in the Middle East is the Comparative Revolution by John Hick, who is a philosopher in the 20th century. And the reason he calls it the Comparative Revolution is because Copernicus, in the Renaissance, said our Earth is not the center of the universe. The planets orbit around the sun. Which was very, very upsetting news for most people at the time, who envisioned their Earth as the center of the world, or the center of the universe. And you can really compare this with Freud and Darwin. It was equally upsetting for people to hear that maybe we aren't as special as we thought we were. That maybe we aren't the thing that everything revolves around, the thing that everything is culminating in. We aren't the apex of existence. And so, Hicks says, all religions are planets circling around the same solar truth. Our religion is not the center that everyone else is trying to get to. We aren't the apex of faith. We are all orbiting around the same truth, which is God, he says. And in different, we're very different planets, by the way, but all in very different relationship to the sun, but the basic relationship is we're orbiting around it. And there are those planets who are so distant from the sun, that the gravity of the sun has a weak pull on it, but it's still pulling. That same truth is at the core of everything, and you can't escape the gravity of the sun. So I struggled with that, I wrestled with that. And I had to come up with something. I had to write a paper about, basically it was called Faith Boundaries. I had to write a paper about who I believe is saved and who is not. Which is a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. But one thing that I came up with is cognitive nomadism. And this is from March 16. I'm not sure I totally agree with this anymore, but this is where I was when I was writing the paper. Losing life, and even the prospect of losing life or losing people in our life, can fill us with dread and bring us to our knees in prayer or despair. When I ask, what is it that saves us from this dread? The consensus among the monotheistic religious traditions is that it is our faith that saves us, our personal trust in God, and that is enough for me. Some may complain that this is a bit minimalistic, to which I would respond, of course it is. I've decided to live according to a philosophy of cognitive nomadism. I set up structures that I can live in and work with, but I don't feel the need to set anything in stone. I build my belief with sticks and canvas, not with stones and mortar. This is based on a radical humility and openness to others in the world. So basically, my answer was, I don't have an answer. And yet you need to live. You can't just not live. You can't just not live anywhere. You can't stop existing. That's called suicide, and it's really unpleasant. You need to live. So how do you live in the midst of not knowing? And when there are, and I would make the analogy like this, there are cities with fortifications and walls and armies to defend themselves. And yet, if you put yourself into one city, you're going to be at war with another city, just by being a citizen of that one. That happens a lot. It doesn't need to happen. There are those within the city that choose to somehow be a citizen of it, but not really be like in conflict with the others. That is so challenging. So at this time, in this time of my life, in March, I decided that it was much easier to just not be in a city, to just be a nomad of faith, to set up a tent where I needed to be, live off the land that was around me, so to speak, and to completely rely on a very minimalistic faith of God at the center, and that's got to be enough for now. And for a long time it was. You can ask me more about what happens later. So now I'd like to move into talking about reconciliation, because that is the problem of the cities. Remember? There's conflict. There are conflicting identities. And so what hope do we have? So I'd like to talk about identity, healing, and justice. First, and I presented this in a class earlier this semester, what is reconciliation? And why do we need it? Basically, I believe that the world is filled with alienation and brokenness. Things are fallen. They are not as they should be. Humans are dehumanized. Relationships and systems are broken all over the world. Reconciliation, then, is the work of healing that alienation and brokenness, of restoring health and life to relationships that are sick and dying. It's very difficult work to do, and it can be exhausting, which is why there needs to be a source of life. There needs to be living water. You need to be attached to the vine, Jesus says, or else you're going to fail. You cannot do the work of reconciliation alone, or you get burnt out and kicked to the curb. Let's talk a bit about identity. There were two major categories of identity that I experienced and interacted with when I was in the Middle East, namely religion and nationalism. So personally, I have to ask myself, what does it mean to be a Christian? And that can be an easy question if you make it, but for me it's a very difficult question, because there are so many different pieces in the mosaic of Christianity that if I try to define what Christianity is for me, it's going to exclude someone else who also calls himself Christian, just because I don't know enough to include the whole thing. And if I tried, I'm afraid my mind would explode because it's so big. There are forms of Christianity that I've never heard of, which for an avid reader like me is a big deal. So what does it mean to be a Christian? And second, what does it mean to be an American? I've struggled with this. I've asked myself, why am I an American? Is it just because I was born here? That doesn't seem right. There are people that have been born here that I would rather believe are not really Americans because they so go against the ethos and the values of America as I see it. So they're born here, but I don't think they're quite Americans. At the same time, there are people who weren't born here who are way more American than I am in some ways, who have bought into that value system and that way of being and that identity with much more fervor and fire in them than I have. So that's an interesting question. What does it mean to be American? But then we can broaden it. And what I was learning about when I was in the Middle East is that people the world over, if they ask deep questions like I do, they ask themselves, what does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be Palestinian? What does it mean to be a Muslim? There's debate about that. There are people who would rather exclude other Muslims from Islam. And what does it mean to be Turkish? Which is really complicated because the idea of Turkishness was only invented in the past century. There were Turks, but there wasn't like Turkish nationalism. That's really recent, and they're still working that out in very much the same way as America is still, hundreds of years after its founding, trying to figure out what does it mean to be American. So in other words, how many different ways are there to be blank? How many different ways are there to be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, American? What's the core of that identity? So the three questions of identity are, who am I, who are we, and who are they? You have the individual identity. How do you fit in the bigger picture? There's the collective identity of the group. How do we fit into the bigger picture, and how does our group, I'm belonging to that group, how does our group relate to other groups? The second, who are they? If we isolate ourselves and put ourselves into a vacuum without interacting, then we have no life. So there are serious challenges of identity. But then, back to Wolff, exclusion and embrace. He says about identity and relationships, there can be no justice without the will to embrace. It is, however, equally true that there can be no genuine and lasting embrace without justice. And he says, if you want justice and nothing but justice, you will inevitably get injustice. If you want justice without injustice, you must want love. If we are sticklers about justice and this needs to be fair and you need to be punished for bad things you do and rewarded for good things that you do, without having any concern about love, we're going to end up with an unjust system because there are going to be people who are oppressed by our ideas that we are trying to thrust into the forefront and into a system of power. It's much, much more important to emphasize justice and love, because then you can have a system where there's true justice, which is a lot harder to get to. So, I'd like to make this a bit more specific and talk about obstacles to peace in Palestine. What stands in the way of peace today? And this is where that quote from Ecclesiastes comes in, which with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. The deeper I get into this conflict, there are snippets of hope around, but the deeper I get into it, the more grief there is, the more sorrow I feel for it, because it goes deep. It's conflict all the way down. So this is an image of separation wall, which is, to me, the most obvious physical manifestation of a barrier to peace. There is physical segregation, separation, some have even called it apartheid, between Israel and Palestine. And when you can't have that interaction, when you can't go across the border and have that double vision, as Wolff was talking about, you cannot have peace. That is absolutely impossible. So, I'd like to talk about some broad historical trends in the region. And there are some internal problems. The guest speaker told us that if there's going to be peace, both sides need to have strong leaders that everyone can get behind. And that's lacking right now. The leadership often polarizes people. There's also a power imbalance between Israel and Palestine in the international community and in the region. There's an obvious difference between who's in power and who is being powered over. There's also a lack of contact and relationship between the people of Israel and Palestine. And there are a lot of double standards and contract mentality going around. Contract as opposed to a covenant where you're in it no matter what. Contract is, I'm in it as long as you do what I want you to do. So you can break commitments because you feel justified, because the other has failed you in some way. They haven't met your standards, so you don't have to meet your end of the deal anymore. Then there are external things that are outside of the specific region of Israel and Palestine. There is a conflict of American interests in regards to other factors. For a long time, it was the Soviet Union. We don't really care exactly what happens to Israel and Palestine as long as we can stick it to the Kremlin. And that was the policy for a very long time. Also, oil and presidential re-election. If a president wants to get re-elected, it's almost a fact of American politics in America that they have to, in their first term, support Israel. And if they want to have a chance at doing something great in their second term, if they even want a second term, they need to show that they have an interest in Israel. And that is a fact. There's also a lack of international education, which is starting to be transformed, starting to be renewed and opened up. And there's a polarization of perspectives. It's very difficult to find anyone who does not have a strong opinion, if they have an opinion, on this issue. It's very difficult to find someone who is not absolutely pro-Israel or absolutely pro-Palestine and Israel is the occupier. Really hard to find anyone who can sit in creative tension between the two, partly because people who do that get assassinated if they're in leadership positions. Because they're really unpopular for people who are on opposite ends of the spectrum. Also, there are specific concrete issues, like the settlements, separation wall, the ghettoization of Gaza, water distribution, the refugee right of return, the military occupation and checkpoints, and also from Israel's perspective, the right to exist without being harassed, a history, a long history of persecution, and this complex identity of Israel as a Jewish nation state, and a democracy that's supposed to have representation of the majority, and opposing viewpoints, and rule of law. And also sacrifices for peace, and the Israeli consensus is that they have done this over and over and over again. They've sacrificed so much just trying to get to some kind of stable peace. And from their perspective, not much has happened. So you have these 2 points that have really difficult situations that they're both living in. They're living in the same place. They both have claims to the land. And that causes a really serious conflict that so far no one has really been able to bring closure and healing and reconciliation to. So we need creative tension, or how not to find easy answers. Because there have been a lot of easy answers in the history of the conflict, and in the region, really. There have been leaders in Egypt and Turkey who have gone for the easy answers instead of the creative tension. And the discouraging thing, and I mentioned this already, is that those who try to live in the creative tension, they often get taken out because they're so vulnerable from both sides. In closing, and I'm going to open up for questions soon, there was this novel that I had to read in my semester, and I read a Turkish novel by a Nobel laureate, Orhan Pamuk. And at the very end of the book, after going through so much about religion and politics and the mess of Turkish nationalism and identity, he asks one of his characters, and this is really creative, the author, asks one of the characters, "What would you want me to tell the readers?" And the character says, "Tell your readers they shouldn't believe anything you write about us." Now this is a quote from the book. "If only to see themselves as wise and superior and humanistic, they need to think of us as sweet and funny and convince themselves that they sympathize with the way we are and even love us. But if you would put in what I've just said, at least your readers will keep a little room for doubt in their minds. So basically, I can tell you about the people of the Middle East, but I'm not sure you should believe me. But, yeah, I'll end with that and open it up for questions. What questions do you have for me?
Isaac, in the spirit of learning from the best of those who are different, what did you learn from Islam that made you think more deeply about your own faith journey?
In Islam, I did a project on forgiveness in Islam. We were all assigned a paper where we study an issue in the Quran, and we have to interview Muslims, our friends, about what they think about the issue, and I was assigned forgiveness. Now, there's a misconception, I think, that there isn't room for forgiveness and grace in Islam. But on the contrary, the difference is that if you ask a Muslim about forgiveness, they say, yes, I will forgive you, but after you have made up for what you did to me. There needs to be justice and a combination of solving the problem, and then I will absolutely forgive you, and it will be absolutely behind us. So there's this very pragmatic sense of things need to really match up on the ground. And that's been a theme in Islam, of a combination between the faith of Islam and the revelation, as well as the political and social leadership of Muhammad from the very beginning, from the get-go. He combined social pragmatism and transcendent faith. And to me, that's really creative tension. That is brilliant, and I really appreciated that in Islam.
Different are you now? Are you basically more hopeful or more concerned about the future of the East? I'm sorry to ask the question, but I'm sure there's no answer to that. I'm just wondering about your state of mind.
The question was, how am I different now? Am I more hopeful about it? Am I more concerned? And I definitely changed. I was going back and reading through papers that I wrote in March when everything was due, like the Faith Boundaries paper. And there are really obvious differences in my thought. I think I'm a lot more hopeful, less cynical about some things. But I worry that that's only because I'm out of it, that I'm not living in it. And that if I were to go back, I would immediately begin feeling cynical again. It's really easy to be hopeful if you're in the world of ideas detached from the reality on the ground. It's much more challenging to be in it and somehow hold on to hope still. So actually a lot of my thought has stayed the same. I was surprised when I read the Faith Boundaries paper, for example, how much of it is still the same. That I still believe some of these things that are kind of out there. But, and I mentioned this in passing, one of the main venues of my change this year has been connecting to a life-changing church. It's very different from being a cognitive nomad. Very different. I've put down roots into my church, into the deeper well of Christian faith, and begun to move my way around that and to take on more fully the identity of Christianity, which means that I can now speak as a Christian instead of speaking as a nomad with no allegiance. So that's one major area of change.
Isaac, I know that you had stayed with a Palestinian family for a few days in Bethlehem. What was their understanding of God in the midst of all the suffering they're enduring? Have you had any conversation with them about how they see God? Hopeful?
The question was about a family that I stayed with in Palestine after the semester ended. I had a great homestay with a grandfatherly old man and his wife and some of his grandkids. It was difficult to communicate with them because I hadn't learned Arabic well because of the upset of the semester. So I don't actually know what they thought about a lot of things. It was a very minimalistic interaction, again. It was waking up and having breakfast with them, really feeling their hospitality, playing backgammon with the guy, which was great. To come home from seeing all of the mess of Palestine and to be in a house that's full of love, and full of hospitality and grace for each other and for me, really welcoming in a complete stranger. So that was the main thing with that family. There were other families that I interacted with, people that I met at Bethlehem University. And the sense that I got from a lot of them, or some of them I should say, are very skeptical that God has anything to do with this. When I was doing my interviews for the Quran paper, I was asking some of my friends, like, okay, so how does what you think interact with the Quran? And they were like, it's not all about the Quran. Why do you think that we actually totally care about what Islam says? And these are Muslims talking. That, a lot of times, they feel like it's irrelevant, which is a very familiar feeling in America with a lot of young people today. It's hard for them to see the connection between God and their lives. And it was rare and really refreshing to meet people who still felt that connection between God and that God is really immanent, that the incarnation made a lasting difference, and that, I should say, in Islam, the incarnation is not in a person, it's the Quran. In the same way that Jesus is the Word of God, the Quran is the Word of God, the saving grace in Islam. This is the ultimate miracle, in the same way that the incarnation and the resurrection are the ultimate miracles of Christianity. The Quran and the Revelation is the ultimate miracle for Muslims. And so I did get to speak with people for who that was a very vibrant part of their lives, and they had deep roots in that, and it really mattered to them what God was doing. But I would say it's kind of a mixed bag. Depends on who you ask.
Thank you.
Where do you go from here? What do you do with who you are and change ideas for your life force? What do you do with all this information? It's not enough for you to spend half an hour with us. You need more.
Yeah, the question is, what do I do next? Half an hour is not enough, so what do I do next? The immediate next thing I do is go to TESOL Methods class. I got that down. But honestly, that's a very good question. I think a lot of it has to do with realizing my identity in community. Community is, I think, on the verge of becoming a bit of a cliche, but it's really very important to me right now, especially my church community and how I interact with them and receive God's love through them, and also send out my love through them, and into the community. Because as a nomad, I felt very alienated. I would call it the felt experience of the absence of God, or incarnational atheism, I call it. So moving into putting roots down into faith is a big step, and it came gradually, still coming. But I would say that the next step in interacting with this conflict and with the history and the politics and the depth of the region is first having a starting point, having a place where I can say, as a Christian, and I can say, as an American, and not just as Isaac Sanborn, I think this. to say, as a member of this church, and as a member of this educational institution, this is what I think. Because that's when things get really deep, when you have some kind of authority behind what you're saying. When you've been invested with the authority to speak from a group, which is very uncomfortable in America, because a lot of us are very individualistic. We don't want to have that authority. We'd rather give it away. But what I'm learning to do is to take real authority on things. That as much as I might not want to have authority on this, I have an experience that you don't have, which at first is very uncomfortable for me. And so I'm learning to take on an identity and take on something worth saying so that I can say it and then do it and live it. So I think every other time. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all for coming.